The first time I heard the captain's name, I was sitting at the end of a bar, eating a bowl of lukewarm chowder and picking shell fragments out of my teeth. The place smelled like bleach and fried halibut, and every table was sticky enough to catch your sleeve if you weren't careful. It was early April, and the docks were swarming with guys getting their boats ready for king crab season. All of them eyeing each other, sizing each other up. So when a guy sat down next to me and said, "Rourke's looking for hands," I laughed into my beer. "Good for Rourke," I said. "He can look somewhere else." The guy was older, late 50s maybe, wiry and sunburned, with a jagged scar down the side of his neck, like someone had tried to gut him. He had the eyes of someone who'd seen too many storms. He leaned closer. "He's offering 25% shares," he said. "Straight cut. No quotas." I stopped chewing. 25% shares on a crab boat was obscene. Ridiculous. Nobody paid that. Not unless they were expecting a payout big enough to make the risk worth it. Or unless they were too desperate to find a crew any other way. "Bullshit," I said. "Suit yourself." The guy tossed back the rest of his drink and stood up. "You won't be the first to say no, and you won't be the first to regret it either." He left, and I tried to go back to my chowder, but the numbers wouldn't stop rattling around in my head. Even if the haul was average, that'd be enough to cover my debts and keep me fed for a year, maybe 2. There was the other thing. Rourke's boat was famous, not just for the money it made, but for the bodies it left behind. A deckhand washed overboard, a guy crushed under a stack of pots. 4 deaths in 6 years, if the rumors were true. The Coast Guard had investigated every time, but nothing had stuck. Accidents, they said. Unfortunate, but not criminal. And yet, she kept hauling in crab like nobody else. Like it was cursed, or charmed, or both. I didn't sleep much that night. The wind was howling outside my bunkhouse window, rattling the glass, whistling through the gaps. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how it would feel to wake up in my own house again. Money in the bank. No creditors breathing down my neck. I thought about the guy at the bar, and his scar. I thought about the bodies. By morning, I'd made up my mind. Rourke's office wasn't much, just a rented trailer on the edge of the docks, smelling faintly of mildew and diesel. He was sitting behind a scarred desk, picking at the corner of an old logbook with a knife. He looked younger than I expected, maybe 45, with sandy hair and a face that might have been handsome once. His eyes were pale blue, like the underside of an iceberg. "You're late," he said, before I even sat down. I didn't know I had an appointment. "You do now." He pointed at the chair. "Sit." I sat. He flipped the logbook shut and studied me. "You know what this job is. I know it pays 25%. He smiled. "Pays more than that, if you can hack it. And if I can't?" He pushed a contract across the desk. 3 pages, dense with legal jargon. But the numbers at the bottom were real enough. I hesitated, just long enough for him to notice. "Look," he said, "you've heard the stories. I won't pretend they're not true. This is hard work, and I don't run a daycare. But I'll tell you the same thing I tell every man who comes through that door." He leaned forward, and for the first time, I saw the veins standing out in his neck, the red rims around his eyes. Not exhaustion. Hunger. "You work for me. You'll make more money in 3 months than most guys see in 3 years. But if you want to walk away, do it now. Once you're on my boat, you don't get to change your mind." I signed the contract. The Northern Dawn sailed the next morning. The deck was slick with frost. The sky bruised purple and gray. I stood at the rail, watching the harbor shrink behind us, wondering if I'd just made the best decision of my life, or the last one. The first few days at sea slipped past in a blur of hard labor and heavier catches. The Northern Dawn pitched and shuddered as we worked, but it cut through the water with a stubbornness that matched its captain. The deck was a battlefield, tangled lines, the sharp snap of crab claws, and ever-accumulating ice. The air reeked of diesel and brine, but the pots kept coming up full. So full we could hardly keep up. Rourke stalked the deck like a man possessed. He barked orders between drags on his cigarette, his voice slicing through the wind. The rest of the crew moved in practiced silence. Bill and Marty, both older, both built like dock pilings, never said much. They didn't have to. Derek, the youngest, scrambled to keep pace. He dropped tools, fumbled knots, and flinched whenever Rourke's attention snapped his way. More than once I thought the kid might walk, but he stuck it out, jaw clenched, and hands bleeding. I kept to the work. The boat rocked and groaned under us, but it held steady. The crew didn't. Not entirely. They flinched at shadows, at every groan in the hull. It wasn't just the storm on the horizon that had them spooked. It was Rourke. I started to feel it too, the itch between my shoulders, the sense that something wasn't right. By day 3, the seas had turned. Waves pounded the hull, throwing spray over the rails and soaking everything we touched. We tied in with safety lines, gritting our teeth as we wrestled pots that felt heavier with every haul. Derek lost one, a pot worth thousands, and before anyone could stop him, Rourke had him by the collar, shoving him against the rail. "You think this is a joke?" Rourke's voice cut through the wind. "You screw up again, you're going in after it." Derek didn't speak. He just nodded, wide-eyed, and went back to work. None of us said a word. That night, the wind shifted. The sky went dark and low, the kind of black that smothers sound. Rourke stood in the wheelhouse, staring at the radar. The rest of us huddled in the galley, eating cold sandwiches with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Derek sat apart, rubbing his fingers. The tips were red and swollen. "We're heading back, right?" he asked. Bill looked at him, then shook his head. "Not with Rourke. He wouldn't push through this, would he?" Derek's voice wavered. Nobody answered. The next morning, the storm hit. Walls of water slammed against the hull, shoving the Northern Dawn sideways like a toy. Rain pounded the deck, driven horizontal by the wind. The air was thick with salt spray and panic. We couldn't see the horizon, just the heaving black of the ocean and the flashes of lightning that lit up the chaos. We worked the gear as long as we could. Pots bucked like wild animals as we tried to secure them, the cables jerking and snapping in the gale. 2 men slipped. One of them went over the rail, but we caught him before the waves took him. My hands were raw. The tanks were full, but it didn't matter. All we could do was keep moving, keep trying to hold the boat together. Then, we started taking on water. It started as a trickle below deck, nothing unusual, but it didn't stop. The bilge pumps couldn't keep up, and soon we were ankle deep, then knee deep. The Northern Dawn groaned and shuddered with every wave, and I felt it in my bones. The boat wasn't going to make it. "We need to call it in," I shouted over the storm. "We need to call Mayday." Rourke was at the wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon like he could outstare the storm. "We keep going," he said. "We're not done yet." "We are done," one of the older crewmen yelled. "This isn't a goddamn game, Rourke." For the first time, Rourke turned and looked at us. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. And that's when I saw it. The edge of something cracked, something broken. He pulled a gun from under his coat. "Nobody leaves this boat," he said. We froze. The storm screamed around us, but the deck went silent. "You're out of your mind," I said. "You don't get it," Rourke said, his voice shaking. "This boat doesn't sink without me, without us. We go down, together." He started tying the crew up, one by one, lashing their wrists to the rail. The wind howled, the boat pitched, water poured over the deck, but he didn't stop. I watched, waiting, looking for an opening. When he came for me, I moved. I hit him hard, slamming him against the wheelhouse. The gun went off, but the shot was wild, lost in the storm. We grappled, slipping and sliding on the slick deck, and I felt the gun barrel scrape against my ribs. I twisted, driving my elbow into his throat. He went down, and I grabbed the gun. I didn't have time to think. I pointed it at him and shouted for the others to free themselves. They tore at the ropes, cutting each other loose while I kept the gun trained on Rourke. He didn't move. He just sat there, staring at me like he couldn't believe what had happened. "Call the Mayday," I said. One of the crew grabbed the radio and started broadcasting. The rest of us lowered the lifeboat, fighting the waves as we piled in. I was the last one off, still holding the gun as I climbed over the rail. Rourke didn't follow. He just stood there, gripping the wheel, as the water rose around his ankles. We drifted away, the lifeboat rocking in the waves, and watched as the Northern Dawn went under. It didn't go quietly. The hull split with a sound like thunder, and then it was gone, swallowed by the blackness. I was broke enough to strip down to my skin for money. They called it life modeling, an artistic term that made it sound dignified, almost noble. But let's be real, it was nude modeling, plain and simple. At first it felt strange, standing there with nothing but the hum of a space heater and the scrape of charcoal against paper to keep me company. But after a few sessions, the awkwardness melted away. The artist didn't really see me anyway. To them, I was no different than a vase or a draped sheet, just a collection of lines, curves, and shadows to capture. Eventually, I stopped noticing the eyes, stopped caring altogether. It was just a job, and jobs meant paychecks, even if this one required me to leave my dignity in the dressing room. One evening, after the room had emptied, and I was pulling my sweater over my head, a painter lingered by the easels. He looked like an old-timey actor, silver streaks at his temples and a loosely knotted scarf slung around his neck, as if he'd wandered straight from a French cafe. His hands were stained with paint, blue smudges under his nails, streaks along his knuckles. His name was Marcus, and when he smiled, it wasn't casual. It was the kind of smile that suggested he'd already decided something about me, like he saw something in me that no one else had noticed yet. "You ever do private modeling?" he asked. I froze. Private. The word hung there, loaded with unspoken possibilities I wasn't ready to consider. Marcus must have caught the hesitation in my face, because he raised his hands, palms up, like he was warding off my suspicion. "It's legitimate," he said quickly. "Just one-on-one sessions in my studio. Triple what you make here." Triple. That word latched onto my brain and wouldn't let go. Rent was already 2 weeks late. The last can of beans in my cupboard was staring at me every time I opened it, and I'd started measuring out instant noodles like I was counting coins. The numbers made sense, even if my instincts didn't. "I'll think about it," I said, like I wasn't desperate enough to say yes on the spot. Marcus didn't push. He just handed me a business card, the kind of card that looked expensive to print. "Take your time," he said, "but I think you'd be perfect for this series I'm starting." I sat in bed and Googled him. His work hit me like a punch to the stomach. Raw, unflinching, and somehow both beautiful and unsettling. The faces in his paintings didn't just look at you. They stared you down, like they saw through you. He captured light in a way that felt alive, and I'd never seen eyes painted so realistically. It gave me this weird, uncanny valley kind of feeling. I called him the next day. His studio smelled faintly of oil paint and varnish, sharp enough to sting if you breathed too deeply. Light pooled through high windows, cutting across the concrete floor in hard angles. Canvases leaned against the walls like resting bodies, some shrouded in sheets, others turned backward as if caught in some act they weren't ready to confess. Marcus moved through the space like it was built around him, deliberate, steady, confident. I tried not to stare, but my eyes snagged on the glimpses I could see. Sketches pinned up, landscapes blurred at the edges, almost feverish in their colors. The covered canvases pulled at my attention, like whispers you can't quite make out. Marcus caught me looking. "Those aren't ready," he said, stepping between me and the nearest one. His voice was light, but something sharp flickered in his eyes. I murmured an apology and pulled off my sweater, pretending I hadn't noticed. Artists had their rituals, their habits. I told myself it wasn't strange. Still, standing there, half undressed in the quiet, I felt the weight of the space closing in. The hum of the heater seemed louder than before, vibrating low in my bones. It was different from the class. No voices murmuring, no pencils scratching, no soft laughs to break the silence. Just me, and him, and the stretch of empty air between us. In the classroom, I could fade into the background, just another object to be studied. Here, the walls felt too tight, and Marcus's gaze lingered too long, tracing outlines even when he wasn't holding a brush. I wondered if I should say something, shatter the stillness, but my throat stayed tight. I told myself I was being dramatic, that his silence was just focus, but I couldn't shake the feeling that, in this space, I wasn't a model. I was raw material, something waiting to be shaped. He painted in quick, sharp motions, brushing color onto the canvas like he was coaxing something from the surface. Sometimes he leaned back, eyes narrowing, and tilted his head as if listening. Other times, he murmured under his breath, the words too soft to catch. I wondered if he even knew he was doing it. Watching him work felt intrusive, but also intimate, like I'd been allowed into a space no one else had seen. And yet, it struck me that I wasn't just being looked at. I was looking too, studying him, the way he studied me. It was the same kind of scrutiny, the same unguarded inspection, and for a moment, that balance felt almost like power. The first session was uneventful. Marcus barely spoke, absorbed in his work. I held the poses he directed, feeling his gaze scrape over me in silence. When it ended, he threw a cloth over the easel before I could see. "I only show my work when it's finished," he said. He didn't elaborate. The second session started the same way, but it didn't end that way. Halfway through, someone knocked at the door. Marcus wiped his hands and stepped out, muttering about a delivery. I shifted, stretching the ache from my shoulders. My eyes went to the canvases again, the covered ones. I told myself not to, but my feet were already moving. I turned one around. The woman in the painting stared back, her eyes wide, terrified. Her mouth sealed with tape. Ropes bit into her wrists and ankles. The detail hit like a slap, the bruise blooming under her eye. The wet glint of tears streaked down her cheek. I stepped back, knocking into another canvas. It tipped. More faces, more bound wrists, more taped mouths. The light in the paintings was soft, almost reverent, but it only made them worse. My stomach turned. One of the faces looked familiar. Too familiar. The face of a teenage girl who had gone missing just a few months ago. I stumbled to Marcus's easel and ripped the cloth away. My face stared back, twisted, contorted, wrists bound, my mouth open in a scream. The door creaked. Marcus stood there, eyes settling on me. He didn't look surprised. "What do you think?" he asked. His voice was calm. My pulse wasn't. I forced a smile, hoping he couldn't see my hand shaking. "They're striking." Marcus tilted his head. "Striking?" I nodded. "You shouldn't have looked," he said. "That one over there," I said. "That's Misty Graves, isn't it?" His eyes slid in the direction of the painting, but his gaze remained fixed on me. "So?" he replied coolly. It dawned on me. I was facing a killer. He must have recognized the look on my face. He stepped toward me. On a side table next to me was a can of paint thinner. I grabbed it, flicked open the plastic latch covering the spout. Marcus lunged for me. I threw the thinner at his face and ran. The sharp smell clung to me as I bolted through the door and into my car. I sped home. When I could think straight, I called the police and told them everything, showed them the card he'd given me, described the paintings. They took my statement, but I could tell they were humoring me, dismissive, like I was just some crazy girl. I followed up the next day. They told me they checked the studio, but it was empty. The place was a rental, and none of the neighbors had much to say about the guy who was living there. "What about the landlord?" I demanded, my voice shaking with disbelief. "Listen, lady," the officer said. "We talked to the owner. I'm not going to tell you the name of the person who was renting that house, but it wasn't Marcus." The line went dead. I couldn't believe it. Marcus had vanished.
I've debated sharing this for years, but I keep thinking about it, especially now as the weather's turned. Maybe writing it down will help, or even save someone from what I went through. This happened when I was living in eastern British Columbia a few years back, before the pandemic. My friend Alex, who let me just say up front, was the guy when it came to hiking and mountaineering, invited me on what he called a next level trek. He'd done countless backcountry expeditions and was someone you could always count on. The idea of learning from Alex on a 2-week trip sounded incredible. When he sent me photos of the ridges and frozen lakes and streams we'd cross, I said yes without hesitation. Packing for the trip was almost as exciting as the trek itself. Alex was meticulous, laying out all our gear like it was a military operation. He checked everything twice, and made sure I had enough layers to survive possible freezing temperatures. "You'll thank me later," he said, tossing a pair of extra warm gloves into my bag. His kit had everything: a flint for starting fires, an avalanche transponder, even a massive knife, the kind you'd expect to see in a survivalist guidebook. "You never know when you might need it," he joked. The first 3 days were picture perfect, with great weather and a challenging but manageable trail. Alex was in his element, mapping routes and landmarks, teaching me to read trail signs and tell the difference between human and animal tracks. He told stories from previous treks, like the time he navigated through a thick fog for 2 days with just a compass. It felt amazing to be in nature and connecting with my friend on this new level. Then, on the 4th day, the weather turned. I'll never forget how fast it hit. 1 minute, we were hiking under a perfectly clear blue sky, and the next, we were in whiteout conditions. The wind was this constant, icy roar, and the snow came down so hard, it felt like being slapped with sandpaper. Alex stayed calm though. He got us into a sheltered spot beneath some trees, rigged up a tarp, and told me it'd blow over soon. "Storms like this pass quickly," he said, but I caught him glancing at the sky more than usual. It didn't pass. By the next day, the trail we'd been following was buried under 3 feet of snow. Every step outside the shelter was brutal, like wading through wet cement. We were officially stuck. Alex kept saying we'd wait it out, but I could tell he didn't believe it. He started muttering under his breath, "This can't be happening," or "We've been through worse." We rationed our food down to what felt like crumbs, but after several days, the hunger was constant. And it wasn't just that. I couldn't shake the cold. No matter how close I sat to the fire, it felt like the ice in my bones wasn't going anywhere. Every minute stretched, and every hour felt longer than the last. That's when Alex started acting off. At first it was little things. He got irritable over nothing, like when I suggested we try and hunt animals for food. Then I'd catch him staring into the blizzard, like he was waiting for someone. One night, I woke up to see him sitting upright, whispering to himself. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said, "We'll be fine," but he didn't sound sure anymore. As the days dragged on, Alex's behavior became harder to ignore. He'd snap at me over innocent suggestions, like melting snow for extra water, or taking turns keeping the fire going. Then his mood darkened, and he started looking at me differently, like I wasn't his friend anymore, but someone to be wary of. One evening, as we sat in the dim light of the fire, he accused me of taking more than my share of food. It caught me off guard. This was Alex, the guy who planned every detail of this trip. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but his expression didn't change. His eyes were sharp. "You think this is funny?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. The accusations kept coming. By the 3rd or 4th time, it was no longer just about food. He started saying I was hiding things. Extra supplies, matches, even a secret stash of energy bars. One night he exploded out of nowhere. He grabbed my pack, yanked it open, and dumped everything onto the ground. Socks, a flashlight, my journal, all of it spilled out into the snow. "Where is it?" he yelled, his voice echoing. I stammered, trying to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. He was pacing in tight circles, running his hands through his hair, muttering under his breath about how I'd led us here on purpose, like I masterminded the whole disaster. It wasn't just his words either. His confidence, that reliable energy he always carried, was all but gone. He twitched now, his movements jerky and restless, like his body couldn't contain whatever he was thinking. His eyes darted around the shelter, barely landing on anything for more than a second. The Alex I knew, who taught me how to read trail signs and crack jokes about bears, was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. I didn't know what to say. Every attempt to reason with him seemed to make it worse. He'd fix me with this intense, almost predatory stare, like he was waiting for me to slip up and prove him right. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, pretending to sleep, I could hear him pacing outside the shelter, his boots crunching in the snow, his muttering growing louder. I caught fragments of his words. Can't trust him. Should have known. My chest felt tight. For the first time I started wondering if I'd make it off the mountain with Alex, still as my friend, or even at all. The worst part was the knife. I don't know where he'd been hiding it, but suddenly it was always in his hand. It wasn't casual either. He'd grip it tight, his knuckles white. When I asked why he had it, he gave me this look, like I was too stupid to understand. It's the only way, he said. At night, his whispers got louder. I started sleeping with my boots on, just in case I needed to get out fast. When the storm finally broke, I thought we were saved. The sun came out, and the snow sparkled like nothing had happened. But Alex was worse. That morning, he cornered me by the fire. His face was sunken, his eyes wild, and he had the knife out. You brought us here, he said, his voice trembling. You did this. I tried to reason with him, but he wasn't hearing it. He lunged at me, and I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my heartbeat in my ears, the crunch of snow as I scrambled away, and the way the knife glinted in the sunlight. Then, suddenly, voices. Real human voices. The rescue team showed up like something out of a dream. They pulled Alex off me and got us down the mountain. He had to be sedated, and I found out later they took him straight to a psychiatric facility. The doctor said it was starvation, hypothermia, and the stress of being stranded. It all added up. I tried visiting him once. He seemed calmer, almost like himself again. But there was something in his eyes I couldn't ignore. It was like looking at a broken mirror. You can't see the crack, but you know it's there. We don't talk anymore. He reached out a few times, but I can't bring myself to respond. Every winter, though, I think about that trip. About the snow, the cold, and the way Alex's voice sounded when he whispered, "It's the only way."
Nosferatu shouldn't exist. That's probably the simplest way to put it. When it was released in 1922, the courts ruled it was an illegal adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula and ordered all copies destroyed. Florence, Bram Stoker's widow, pushed hard for the ruling, and she got it. Every print of the film was supposed to be burned, every trace of it wiped out. But somehow, that didn't happen. Film collectors, archivists, or just plain luck. Whatever the reason, some copies survived. Not many, but enough. Those prints went on to cement Nosferatu's reputation as one of the most important horror films ever made. People still study it, screen it, and argue about its influence over the genre. But there's another side to the film's story, a quieter one that doesn't make it into academic essays or documentaries. It's said that not every reel of Nosferatu that escaped destruction is accounted for. Most of what survives matches the original release, but there are rumors, persistent ones, about other prints. Strange reels that don't align with any known version of the film. Some say they're incomplete scenes Murnau shot and abandoned. Others suggest they were never meant to be part of the film at all. Whatever they are, they're supposed to be different, and not in a good way. There are stories, as there always are with things like this. People who claim to have seen one of these reels, or to know someone who did. The details are always vague, but certain patterns repeat. Scenes where shadows don't behave the way they should, where figures seem to move in ways that defy explanation, or sequences that seem mundane at first, but leave you feeling uneasy for reasons you can't quite pin down. For the most part, these rumors are easy to dismiss. But then, there are the harder to ignore cases, the ones that make you wonder if there's more to the story. Two in particular stand out. One is strange and unsettling, the other horrific in a way that's difficult to even talk about. Together, they become the foundation for the so-called curse of the lost reels. The first story comes from the 1970s, involving a private film collector in New York. His name doesn't appear in any official record tied to this, and those who have talked about him tend to call him by pseudonyms, like Mr. F. But enough fragments of his story have surfaced over the years to piece together the broad strokes. Mr. F was what you'd expect from someone in that world. Wealthy, reclusive, and obsessed with cinema history. He was known for seeking out rare prints, often traveling internationally to buy them directly from estate sales, archives, or other collections. According to one account, he came across an unusual reel of Nosferatu in a private auction catalog. It was simply labeled Reel 5. No provenance, no explanation of what made it significant, just the name of the film and the reel number. Naturally, he had to have it. The reel arrived at his home in an unmarked metal canister. Its condition was described as remarkably good for its age. Mr. F set up his projector that same night and watched it through. At first he was thrilled. It wasn't like anything he'd seen before. There were familiar moments, sure, but also extended sequences that didn't match the known versions of the film. Long, lingering shots of Orlok in his castle, staring directly into the camera. The angle didn't feel like something Murnau would have framed. It was almost confrontational, as though Orlok were aware of the viewer. Over the next few weeks, Mr. F became increasingly obsessed with the reel. He screened it repeatedly, noting minor details he swore hadn't been there on previous viewings. Friends who visited him during this time said he grew withdrawn and erratic, muttering about how the film changed when he watched it. He told one confidant that the shadows in the reel didn't behave the way shadows should, as though they had their own intent. Then, one day, he disappeared. The police were called to his home after neighbors noticed the lights hadn't gone off for several days. They found his house eerily empty, as though he had simply walked out in the middle of something. The only thing out of place was his projector, still running the Nosferatu reel on an endless loop. It was clear the reel had been watched extensively. Its edges were brittle, and some frames were warped from the heat of the bulb. The reel was taken into evidence, but it didn't stay there for long. Shortly after being logged, it vanished from police storage. There's no official record of what happened to it, though unofficially, several officers at the precinct reported strange incidents during the brief time it was in their possession. One officer claimed the shadows in the reel seemed to shift slightly when no one was looking. Another quit the force without warning a few days after viewing it. As for Mr. F, no trace of him was ever found. His remaining collection was auctioned off in the years that followed, but the infamous reel was, and remains, unaccounted for. The story is often dismissed as urban legend, but those who knew him, and who speak carefully of what they saw in that house, seem less certain. They don't like to linger on the subject, usually ending their accounts with the same vague warning. Some things weren't meant to be preserved. The second story is darker, much darker, and hard to dismiss as mere urban legend. It centers on a well-respected film historian, a man with decades of expertise in silent cinema. His work was widely regarded as meticulous, and he was a frequent guest at film festivals and universities, where he lectured on the history of early filmmaking. He was known for his professionalism
and his careful approach to archival research, but all of that changed after he found the reel while visiting a remote archive in Eastern Europe. According to those familiar with the story, the reel had been mislabeled and forgotten in storage for decades. The archive who showed it to him described it as unusual and unrelated to known prints of Nosferatu. The historian, intrigued by the possibility of uncovering something new, convinced the archive to sell it to him, paying a significant sum for what he believed was an invaluable piece of film history. When he returned home, he immediately began studying the reel. What he found was unlike anything he'd ever seen. The footage wasn't simply an alternate version or extended cut of Nosferatu. It was something else entirely. Disjointed sequences depicted shadowy, indistinct figures moving in ways that defied logic, jerking, bending, and twisting unnaturally. The lighting was erratic, with frames shifting between stark, overexposed brightness and deep, impenetrable blackness. What disturbed him most were brief flashes of a figure that appeared throughout the reel. The man bore a strong resemblance to F.W. Murnau, the director of Nosferatu, but this wasn't Murnau as he was known in production stills or portraits. In the footage, he seemed lost, wandering aimlessly through the strange, desolate landscapes. His expression was vacant, almost lifeless, and his movements were slow and erratic. The historian couldn't understand how or why this footage existed. It didn't fit with anything he knew about the film or its production. As the weeks passed, those who knew him began noticing unsettling changes in his behavior. He became reclusive, cutting off contact with colleagues and friends. His lectures and research projects were abandoned without explanation. On the rare occasion he spoke with others, he was described as agitated, muttering about how the reel was unfinished and how it needed him to complete its story. At one point, he referred to the footage not as it, but as him, as though the reel were a living presence. Then came the announcement of a special screening at a small, independent theater. The event was advertised as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to view a newly discovered reel of Nosferatu. The historian framed it as an extraordinary historical find, something that would redefine the legacy of the film. The screening began normally, with the historian introducing the reel. Attendees later described him as pale and visibly nervous, his voice trembling as he spoke. The theater was packed that night, filled with students, film buffs, and fellow academics eager to see this mysterious footage. When the film started, the audience was immediately struck by its strangeness. The imagery was disjointed and unsettling, with shadows that seemed to ripple and shift in ways that didn't match the movement of the characters. Several attendees reported feeling an oppressive sense of unease, as though the film were actively watching them. At some point during the screening, the historian slipped out of the projection booth. Without anyone noticing, he locked the main theater doors from the outside and doused the entrance with gasoline. Moments later, he lit the fire. Panic broke out inside the theater as smoke filled the room. Some audience members managed to escape through emergency exits or by breaking windows, but others weren't so lucky. When the fire was extinguished, the historian's body was found near the theater entrance, burned beyond recognition. The reel itself was presumed destroyed in the blaze, though no fragments were ever recovered. Survivors of the event described the footage in cryptic, fragmented ways. Some claimed to have seen the shadows on the screen moving independently, extending outwards as though they were trying to escape from the frame. Others swore that the figure resembling Murnau had turned to face the audience, speaking in a low, incomprehensible voice that seemed to echo in their minds long after they had fled. But they all agreed on one thing: the reel was unlike anything they had ever seen. In the aftermath, the incident was officially ruled an accident, attributed to faulty wiring in the old theater. The historian's name and career were quietly erased from most records, his work overshadowed by the tragedy. The story has since become one of the darker legends surrounding Nosferatu. Whether the real truly existed, or was simply a fragment of the historian's deteriorating mind, remains a matter of speculation. But those who were there that night insist the film was real, and that it was never meant to be seen. What's undeniable is the film's uncanny ability to survive, despite every effort to destroy it. With a new version of Nosferatu now in theaters, interest in the film's history and lost reels can only increase. But if the rumors of the curse are true, we can only hope if any copies of those lost reels still exist, they are locked away, somewhere no one can ever find them.
Three months into my Europe trip, I landed in Romania, broken, wondering if I'd bitten off more than I could handle. Backpacking had seemed romantic back home. Train rides through rolling hills, cheap hostels packed with interesting people. But by the time I crossed into Bucharest, reality had set in. My boots were falling apart, my backpack straps dug into my shoulders, and I'd been living off convenience store sandwiches for weeks. Still, I wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. Romania hadn't been part of the plan. By now, I was supposed to be in Greece, but a guy I met at a hostel in Budapest convinced me to head east instead. Cheap, wild, and untouched by tourists, he'd said. It sounded a little too good to be true, but then again, half the fun of this trip was chasing impulse, so I hopped a train and didn't look back. The first few days were a blur, some of the best of the whole trip. Bucharest was loud and chaotic, a mix of crumbling buildings and neon-lit cafes overflowing with people. But it wasn't until I reached Brașov, nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, that things began to slow down. The town felt like something out of a fairy tale, with cobblestone streets and a massive Hollywood-style sign looming on the hill above, and that's where I met Anya. It was a rainy afternoon in the main square. She stood in front of a cafe, ducking under the awning to escape the drizzle. Dark hair twisted into a loose braid. A bright red scarf looped around her neck. Her eyes, so green they almost didn't look real. "Are you lost?" she asked. Her English was perfect, but carried a soft, sing-songy accent, like she was teasing me. "Kind of," I admitted, looking like a drowned rat. I was looking for a place to eat. "Here is good," she said, nodding toward the cafe behind her. I didn't have a better plan, so I followed her inside. She ordered tea. I got coffee and a pastry. By the time we finished, I knew she was from Moldova, studying architecture in Bucharest, and visiting Brașov for the weekend to unwind. We spent the rest of the day wandering through town, Anya showing me her favorite spots, and when she suggested grabbing dinner, I didn't even hesitate. The whole time, I couldn't stop staring at her. By the time we left the restaurant, it was raining again. Anya walked close enough that our shoulders brushed. I told myself it was just the wine making me feel this way. But when she leaned in and kissed me under the streetlights, I knew I was done for. The next week, we were inseparable. Suddenly, backpacking through Europe felt as romantic as I'd imagined. I was elated. But then, little things started to nag at me. Anya never talked much about her life in Moldova, just vague mentions of family and school. And no matter where we went, she always seemed to know someone. Shopkeepers, bartenders, strangers in the park. They'd greet her with nods or half smiles, exchange a few words in Romanian or Russian, then go quiet when they noticed me. I asked her about it once. "I'm good at making friends," she said. And then, one morning, my passport was gone. I'd tucked it into the inner pocket of my backpack, same place as always. But now it wasn't there. I tore the room apart, frantic. Losing a passport was every traveler's worst nightmare. Without it, I was stranded, a foreigner with no proof I even belonged here. I was still rifling through drawers when the door creaked open. Anya stepped inside and held up my passport. Relief hit me in a wave, until I saw the man behind her. He was tall, thick, silent, His head was shaved, and he wore flashy designer sunglasses despite the dim light. He didn't speak or move, just stood there, filling the room with his presence like a wall that had suddenly sprouted eyes. "Looking for this?" Anya dangled the passport by its corner. "Where did you—" I started, but she cut me off. "You need to do something for me," she said, stepping closer. "For us." "Us?" I asked. My stomach sank. She nodded toward the bed, where a small, battered suitcase sat. I hadn't noticed it before. "You're going to take this on the train to Iashi. Someone will meet you there." I stared at her, my pulse roaring in my ears. "What are you talking about? I'm not—" "You will." Her voice hardened. "And you won't ask questions." "No." I shook my head. "Not until you tell me what's going on." The big guy took a single step forward. Just one step, but it was enough. The air shifted. The weight of his silence pressed down, heavy and absolute. "Don't make this difficult," Anya said, setting the passport on the table, just out of reach. "You take the bag, you get on the train, you meet the man, that's it." "What's in the bag?" My voice cracked. "You don't need to know." The room felt smaller, the silence thicker, like the walls were closing in. My eyes darted to the passport, then back to the man, who hadn't stopped staring. "You don't have a choice," Anya said. "If you want to leave Romania, you'll do this." I wanted to say no, to grab the passport and run, but the big guy's gaze pinned me in place. I knew I wasn't in control anymore. The suitcase was heavier than it looked, larger too, with a thick lock on the front. It felt cold when I picked it up, unnaturally cold. I tried not to think about what was inside. Anya's last words echoed in my head. "Don't open it." The guy handed me a fake Romanian ID for using to buy tickets. The train ride was suffocating. I saw accusation in every glance. When we finally pulled into some nameless town, the handoff was quick. The contact was a cab driver pretending to offer me a ride. I gave him the suitcase and told myself it was over. But when I got back, Anya was waiting. She didn't look relieved or grateful. "There's another job," she said, and my stomach twisted. I never saw Anya again. After that, I only dealt with her associate. I did the job, then another, and another. Each time the bags got heavier, the destination stretched farther, more obscure. The rules never changed. Take the train, deliver the package, ask no questions. But the dread grew. I became paranoid. I started spotting the same faces, on platforms, in crowds, even sitting across from me in train cars. Were they following me? Watching? The walls of my life were closing in, but there was no escape. Anya and her associate had made that clear. It was the 8th trip that broke me. The suitcase was massive this time, too heavy, its zipper and hinges dusted with frost. I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing. Halfway through the ride, I ducked into the train's bathroom and locked the stall. My hands were shaking. My breath came fast. I hesitated, staring down at the suitcase, then unzipped it. Cold air spilled out as the lid opened, and for a moment, I couldn't process what I was looking at. Packed in ice, wrapped tightly in plastic, were human organs. A heart, kidneys, lungs. I stumbled back, bile burning my throat. My mind spun. Whose were these? Where were they going? What had I done? Shaking, I forced the suitcase shut, fumbled with the zipper until it locked again. When I stepped out of the stall, the paranoia slammed into me, colder than the air from the bag. The man waiting for the bathroom, hadn't I seen him at the last station? And the woman by the window, why was she staring? I avoided their eyes, sat stiffly in my seat, barely breathed until the train lurched to a stop. When I stepped off the train, my contact was already there, a burly man in a thick coat and dark sunglasses, just like Anya's associate. He didn't speak, just held out his hand for the suitcase. I gave it to him, my stomach churning, and turned to leave. Then tires screeched. Police cars swarmed the station, lights flashing red and blue. Officers poured out, shouting commands in Romanian. The burly man ran, but they tackled him before he made it 5 steps. Someone grabbed me. I barely resisted. Relief and terror hit me at once. Hours later, I was in an interrogation room, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Across from me sat a Romanian officer who spoke good English. "Do you know what you've been involved in?" he asked. I couldn't answer. My mind was blank. He slid a folder across the table. Photos spilled out, underground operating rooms, faces I recognized from train stations, suitcases just like the ones I'd carried. And then I saw her, Anya, half smiling in a grainy picture. "Anya," I breathed. "That's not her real name," the officer said. "She's one of their top operators, recruits foreigners, men like you, for simple, risky jobs." He paused. "You're not the first. Plenty of men. Some don't make it." I stared at her picture. The girl I thought I loved. The girl who'd played me from the start. "We've been tracking this network for some time," the officer went on. "Organs, drugs, weapons. It's serious." "Am I going to prison?" My voice barely came out. The officer sighed. "That depends. Probably not, but if you cooperate, you could go home sooner." "Sooner?" "These investigations take time," he said. "We'll need you to stay in the country." I leaned back in the chair and stared at the lights above me. Somewhere out there, Anya was already pulling someone else into her web. Same voice, same green eyes. I thought I'd been on an adventure, but the truth was, I'd been lost the moment I met her.